I'm Steve the Bookman Eisenstein in Miami Beach, Florida.
I'm Thorne Donnelly with Liberty Books in Palm Beach Gardens, Florida.
And I'm Lynn Thompson with Henry Bemis Books in Charlotte.
And this is the Rare Book Cafe, the world's only internet video program about antiquarian books and book collecting. And it is sponsored by the Florida Antiquarian Book Fair. Today, we have a true point to ponder. And if you look at us smiling, well, there is life after a book fair, because I don't think we were smiling as much when we were packing up. When we were selling, we were happy. But it's a year away for the next one. So we'll be talking about the book fair, and later Thorne Donnelly is going to be talking about books, forgeries, and famous book forgeries. And I'm going to visit the history of Dutch jackets. My wife Edie will be talking to us about miniature books and whatever else she wants to talk about from the book fair. And Lindsay?
Well, it's a great day by chance for our show to fall on Independent Booksellers Day in America. And so we're pleased to be able to congratulate all the independent booksellers who were with you and Thorne and Edie at the book fair last week. I should also mention that Alan Smith, our producer, is on assignment today. And we're delighted to be back in the studio. Everyone is slowly scaling back on your Advil doses, I assume, from unpacking all the books that didn't sell and coming home. And because it is Independent Booksellers Week and you were all gathered in St. Petersburg last week, we're going to start with a segment on how the book fair went. We had 8 hours of live broadcasting from the floor last week, but that's not really the booksellers' experience. So we're going to start here with Steve and Thorne, and then bring in Edie to chat for a bit about what happened last week.
Well, if you want to capture the flavor of the fair, you can start out when you look at our Facebook site on the Rare Book Cafe, and you will see that sign that was in the back of my truck, a 10 by 14 cubed van from U-Haul, and a special thanks to the guys at U-Haul for that. We unloaded 100 boxes of books. We unloaded 33 folding bookcases. We unloaded 7 glass cases, and during the next few hours, with the help of friends, we set the booth up. The booth is set up, the fair opens, people come in. The first thing that I as a book dealer noticed, and I say this with glee this year, was that at least 20% during the course of the 3 days were faces that I have never seen in the 20 years that I've been doing this book fair. They were all new, young faces. I mean, I'm 67, and by young, I mean these were people in their late 20s and 30s, even some younger than that. They were all asking intelligent questions about interesting subject matter, which kind of gives us a view into what people might be looking for. And there's something that we couldn't talk about before the fair, and it might address some people who weren't aware of this, in that we had to change the date of the book fair. We were all a little apprehensive because when you are forced to change dates of a book fair that's gone on for 35 years because the major book fair in New York was going to be the same dates, you were faced with a tremendous logistics problem. And my true hats off and compliments to Sarah Smith and Kevin and everybody that put this show together. This was an event that came out very well, and as much as we didn't want to talk about it beforehand, there were nothing but, how can we say, lesser of all evil choices to make in all the weeks that were available to us between March and April. Sarah very smartly decided to ask the exhibitors what would be the best date. Saint Jerome or Saint Bartholomew, your patron saint of book dealers, and I think I'm still quoting her wrong, blessed the fair with a great event. So we were in the booth, everything's set up, people are coming in. The first thing that happened in our booth was just great, and it always happens during setup. As a dealer, one of the things you want to make sure that happens that guarantees you a good fare is that you have a good sale period during setup. And we were fortunate enough to have brought some things that dealers from other states wanted to buy. Shout out to Will Hutchinson. Thanks for making my show on the first day. You know, and an idea of what we sold, some of the things on the first day, to give you an idea, it was anything from Aspen Magazine and Art to books on sailing that were significant enough to be purchased in an ex-library format. And the fair was just a great event. We went through receipt books and stickers to seal the bags. We have one of the best security systems in this book fair business, where if you buy a book at the fair, the dealer writes a receipt for you. He gives you a copy of the receipt, puts it in a bag. The bag is a special bag made just for the book fair, and you have a special sticker that goes on that bag when you walk up to security. As you are exiting the premise, your book is taken out of the bag, your receipt is matched to the book, and that way we have prevented major loss and theft, and it's a great system. And I could go on, but Thorne, we had all kinds of things going back and forth between the booth. What are some of the things that caught your eye?
Well, one of the things is like what you were saying, is I noticed the young people and very knowledgeable people. I brought with me a copy of Huck Finn, which is one of the harder books to deal with. There's a lot of states, a lot of various points to the thing. And I actually even purchased a second copy of Huck Finn while I was there. We'll talk about that later. There's a book, which I think I've mentioned before. It's called The Bibliography of American Literature. It's, I think it's, I don't know, 10 volumes or something along that line. And this is kind of the Bible for booksellers. When I was talking to a young man in the late 20s or 30s, as you said, I happened to bring this with me, this particular set of notes, because one of the very few places that these guys here at Ball have made a mistake was with Huck Finn. It's a very technical little issue, and it was the terms about the word, the contents, and the misprint of the word decided. This young man knew all of the points. One of the major points for Huck Finn is in the start of it, there's a sculpture, and some of the copies have a fabric at the bottom of it, some don't. Those are fairly obvious. Page 155 has been misprinted in various ways. A lot of people that know that, but this young man was examining the book. He couldn't afford it, but not that much of a problem. But he even knew what I found to be one of the most esoteric points ever in Huck Finn that I had only found out probably the week before. So I thought he was pretty interesting to come in. Again, lots of new faces. I personally was also very worried about the week changing over. There's those of us that live in Florida in particular know a lot that, you know, the snowbirds are a big chunk of any business's sales every year. Matter of fact, in Palm Beach, where I'm somewhat from, a lot of the restaurants, a lot of the stores, they just flat close. I mean, they just, you know, they have what's called the season, which is, roughly Thanksgiving through Easter, something along that line. And so by kicking this back, I think a lot of dealers were a little scared. As it turned out, I haven't seen the final numbers, but I believe we are actually slightly ahead of last year's numbers, which, if you consider the fact that that would be coming from a zero base and still beating last year, which I believe was one of our best years, if not the best year. I was tremendously pleased by the turnout. The weather was nice. You know, you do lose some snowbirds, but you also pick up, I think a lot of the kids may have been down on a spring break or after spring break or something. So all in all, I'm not 100% sure of the date for next year. I believe it is the same weekend, but I'm not too sure about that, which is embarrassing because I've been reelected to the board of directors, unopposed, I might add, so I did win. But we have a new president who's a very good guy, and he's going to be continuing on with our regional meetings and all of that. So the book fair is hale and hearty. Same location. The Coliseum is a lovely, beautiful place. As I think Steve has mentioned, both of us have alcoves next to each other, which are kind of large booths, which I'm always amazed to watch Steve unpack. He has one of the 2 or 3 loading docks that back right into his booth. I actually backed my truck into the other loading dock on the side, and it conveniently is the booth of the gentleman who founded the book fair, but he was conveniently a little late, so we got away with that for about half of my truck till he showed up, and then we had to carry it back in. But I do it slightly differently than Steve. I have cases delivered to me, and I get them. They're already set up for me. The tables are there, courtesy. I don't know, Steve, you have tables, right, as I remember it?
I have, you mean tables and glass case? You had a stand-up glass case that's like 6, 7 feet long, 8 or 9 feet high.
Yeah, I have 2 of those.
Yeah, I was toying with the idea of it this year because I walked up to the guy on the truck before we set up, and I said, "Did you bring any extras just in case?" And I was debating it. They want $300 and something. You could just about buy the case for that price. It kills me when that happens. But I decided no, and I have 7 of my own jeweler glass display cases. So I actually use those, and I'm glad I didn't, because what I had under glass this year, it needed to be under glass, but I had so much in the booth that I really needed the space more than the display. But your booth looked really nice. You had a nice, clean, nice looking booth. My booth is always a little cluttered, and let's just say that after you load 1,000 books and try and sort them and organize them, I have had hunting books in the art section for the last 200, and other things that shouldn't be in different sections. But next year, we'll try and do it a little differently. But it was just phenomenal. We did not stop writing tickets. I have to say that. It just kept going.
Which reminds me, Steve, I owe you some money. I did a couple of your credit cards, and I think I owe you some money. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was just one. If there was more, you tell me, but I think it was just one. Anytime the check is in the mail, let me know. I want to give a special shout out because I did it on Bucks this morning, and I'd love to do it again here. Jasper 52, thank you very much. The checks were in the mail when we got home. And a lot of this stuff, if you are interested in Blukes and couldn't make it to the book fair, call this a little bit of self-promulgation, but Jasper 52 is going to be receiving these things very shortly, and I'm going to put more books up there. So, it's a nice medium-sized auction house that picked up the slack, up the memento of bi-weekly auctions that some of the larger auction houses, just as I was ready to do that, change. So if you are new to the book world and you are looking for somebody, I'd give them a shot. They were very good to us, and I don't see where that would vary if you have the books that they tell you they want you to send them. But going back to the book fair, Lindsay, I have to ask you this question. So you and Kara were monitoring different camera poses that Alan put the camera and people in and such. What was some of the things that caught your eye observing?
Well, every minute of those 8 hours was an experiment. It was kind of like the low-tech version of the first men on the moon. We just hoped that somehow it would all work out and we'd get home at the end. It was a true one-off in terms of harnessing a bunch of different technologies at once. We used Google Hangouts. We used different phone hookups. You'll notice in a number of the live sessions that Alan Stevenson and Amber who were our main sponsors for the fair and who were everywhere at once, it seemed, on the fair floor, were tethered together by a set of earphones. We had we plugged one in each of their ears, and Alan led them around like a school teacher with some kindergarten kids, and they were very good sports. And of course, Stephen Thorne, you both took part in that, and you were good sports as well, as did Edie. We had bits that were just alternating between farce and sublime. The beige carpet sample show out in the lobby had terrible sound, but the fun part was that all the people that Alan interviewed entered into the spirit of the thing. They not only told us what they'd come for and what their book collecting experience was, but they also told us what designer labels they were wearing. And so
well, that's important.
well, you know, that's the key to any red carpet show.
When they were talking about what they were looking for, was there any consistency, or was it the wide variation that could possibly be? Like I asked based more so on, let's say, younger people. I have not seen all the film yet, you know, from the weekend. But were younger people asking for anything or looking for things at the book fair that kind of caught your mind's eye?
It was all over the place. I know we had a father and son team, and I think as soon as they got in the door, they went like this because they both were looking for widely divergent things. But we thought that was way cool. And of course, one of the most impressive, there were several impressive things visually about the show. One was the crowds. The aisles were full all the time when we were on the air. We were on at different times each day. There was always a crowd. We heard, I think, on day 2 in the afternoon that the ATM had run out of money, which is no small measure of success.
Yeah.
At the opening, just before the show began, Alan was able to move inside, and we did a sequence at the front door. And for the first 20 minutes or so, it was nothing but a steady, unceasing stream of people coming in, and then fanning out across the floor of the Coliseum there. So it was really striking just how good-humored they were. And one of the other things that was really fun was when Amber Sheehan was on the show 2 weeks ago, and we jokingly sent her on a quest to because she flung about what's the most expensive or handled. And she said, well, this will be my second book fair, so I've never handled one. We sent her on a quest to find the rarest book in the book fair. And on Saturday, we followed her around, and she would just go up to booksellers and say, I'm looking to handle the rarest book in the book fair. It was straight out of Grimm's fairy tales. And they didn't miss a trick. Mr. Stroud from Williamsburg, the religious book dealer, just walked over and said, I've got some things for you. And he pulled out a choice between a 16th and a leaf from a 12th century illuminated manuscript. And some of the exhibitors looked a little horrified in that deer in the headlights way when Amber came up, but she's just so charming and such a good actress that they all gave way. And so we'll have to get her back and find out which she ultimately chose as the rarest and fairest book of the fair.
Well, you know, it's fun. It's funny because she said she was also a thespian and loves to do vaudeville. She was right at home. I agree. It was wonderful to watch. Speaking of other things that happen at the fair, now you mentioned something interesting about a leaf book. So one of the things that happens at the book fair, on Sundays, you can bring your book in and get it evaluated by the Florida Bibliophile Society. On Sunday, a couple of people showed up, and some other people showed up with interesting books during the, Friday and Saturday. One of the things, for one, since you were the recipient of it,
Yep.
you and I were in the lobby. I jumped in. I wasn't interested. I saw you were. I went back to work. Tell us about the leaf book that you got.
Well, since Lindsay's our scholar, I want him to attempt to identify this for us. I will read the title to it. It is a Mamuse Wuna Taputana Mawe Up Biblum God. I bought one of those. I bought a leaf from that. Since you probably don't have, actually, something of North Carolina, you probably do have people like that. What I bought was what is called
y'all.
Yeah, what I bought was a leaf from something called the Eliot Bible. There's kind of a fun story behind that. Mr. Eliot was a minister in the United States in the 17th century, the mid to late century, and he decided that the heathens, the Indians, needed Christianity, and there was an issue that we resolved with something called the Revolutionary War, that there weren't any Bibles printed in the United States. It was pretty much a monopoly of Great Britain. And so what he did is he went out and translated the Algonquin language, which was the language of the Iroquois Indians, into a Bible. That the quote I just gave you there was pretty much the title page of the first page of the Bible. A lot of words, actually, they didn't have, one of the what comes to mind, which I thought was unusual, they didn't have to translate. One was God, and the other one was salt. I guess the Indian people got their salt from the native, eating the fish, so they didn't have salt pits like we are used to. So they had to use some English words for that. But I was able to buy a leaf of it. It's a kind of a fascinating. The first edition of the book, I do have to look here, was in 1663. And that was the first Bible printed in what is now the United States of America, the continental United States. And I was able to purchase a leaf from the second edition, which is 1685. There's kind of a fun story that goes along with that. When the second President Bush was asking for a Bible from the Library of Congress, apparently his chief of staff, to get inaugurated with, his chief of staff was rather arrogant and said, "Send us the oldest Bible." And apparently they sent Mr. Bush the Algonquin Bible. When he went to look at this thing, it's pretty much impronounceable. And you're mentioning about what we're also known as Pixie. She went to try and pronounce that too for us, and with her good thespians, I have the Bible. It's almost impronounceable, but I did show that leaf to many young people, including one young lady who was in the process of completing her Hebrew studies. And she was pointing out the difference in Hebrew versus the English, and I had her try and read it. So it was kind of helpful for her to realize that, oh my, there was something also that other strange languages out there that are read differently. And along with what Steve was saying about the young people, I did an experiment this year. I think I mentioned a couple of weeks ago that I purchased about 1,000 books that are signed. And some of them are quite valuable, and some, quite honestly, are not. A lot of the one-hit wonders, if you will, go to a couple of book signings, you'll sign off on their book, and nobody ever buys another one. So I had some that I wasn't too sure what to do with. I've listed a lot on my website or Amazon or whatever. Dave, Bibio, our two sponsors, are also going to get a lot of listings. Actually, they have some of them already. And I didn't know what to do with some of the other ones. And so I had a bunch of books. I had a wall of them, several hundred that were first edition. I mean, were signed by the author. And I priced them to $3 to $5. And they flew out of there. I think I was doing a 3 for $10 or something like that, because I was not in the mood to take too many of them home. What I found most interesting was so many of those people commented to me. There was either very older people, or most of my sales to that part of my fair were to younger people. And they were all saying, I did not believe you could buy a signed book for so little. Many of them were just starting to be book collectors. A couple of them I went and talked to about other websites to go on collecting or other things to do. But I think I still have some, and I'll probably bring them back next year, because a lot of the younger people had the impression of, rare, collectible, old, we were talking about the most expensive book there. But there was, in my case, and I know a lot of other dealers there, had books that really were $3, $5, $10, $20 that were rare, collectible. And if you look at what Steve has some, and if you look at what I have, they always say in the book biz, you want to have the cheapest, the best, or the only. And quite honestly, by definition of a signed or autographed book, it is to a certain extent the only, especially if it's inscribed to somebody of interest in like an association copy. I had a couple of those, but primarily these people were really thrilled to see it. So that was kind of fun to get some new book for people.
Another good example of that I thought was this year's youngest bookseller, Quentin Smith, who set up a shelf at the age of 9. He's met his son.
Edie's going to talk about him.
He had some read some pretty banged up books that were very old, but he's the ultimate starter collector. And I predicted at the end of our final show that he would live to see the 100th Florida Antiquarian Book Fair. But I think that's part of what made the fair so interesting, is that it's constantly changing to welcome in those people who are just getting their feet wet in collecting. And you got to start somewhere. So you start with something accessible.
It's in their, it's in their genes. I say this with love and affection towards Mike, Sarah, and everybody. We gave Sarah a picture that Quentin wants, but I'm going to let Edie tell that story. I'm going to bring Edie on in a minute, but I just want to say something that amazed me after 45 years in the rare book field. I have always made the statement that if, I've done it for 45 years, I'm 67. If you do the math and I make it till 90, call me an expert if I mastered 1% of what there is to know. Okay? But this just the living daylights out of me. A woman brought in a book. It was Gone with the Wind. It was signed and inscribed by Margaret Mitchell. It was in a dust jacket. It had some condition issues. I had always been under the impression that finding a Margaret Mitchell signature was one of the hardest things to do. She was not a signer. It was saleable in any condition. And I quote that from a guy who used to advertise in the A.B. Bookman's Weekly, that he would buy anything Gone with the Wind. He was in Atlanta, of course, of all places. I think his name was Herb Sanders, and he had one of the biggest Gone with the Wind collections. Well, okay, you can price anything out of the ballpark. We know this. The woman was asking $10,000 for the book, and I knew she was coming to the fair. And as soon as she came to the fair, I took her from my booth to two of the larger New York, New England area book dealers, and I watched what they did. I introduced them, and I stepped back. Not what I usually do. I'm not a good stepper backer, but I know my place, so I stepped back and I watched. The way that book was turned down because of the condition, and it wasn't pristine by any means, but compared to what we had last year, that we could, not the year before, air signer. Anyway, it wasn't purchased. The bottom line is it wasn't purchased. It really surprised me. The jacket didn't sell. So I guess I'm learning that there are some of the old standards are being replaced. The book's not as rare as I thought it would be. Just a confession. And on that note, I am going to transfer and let you guys go if I'm not missing this the right way. I'm going to change. You guys take over. I apologize for that one. Go ahead.
So the one thing, well, Lindsay, go on.
Oh, I was just going to explain to the audience that we're still getting our sea legs back after 2 weeks off. And so the usual switch that you don't see is being replaced by a live in-person switch here. And we're glad to be able to welcome back our national Edie Eisenstein, who is looking radiant after a 3-day run at the Florida Antiquarian Book Fair. And we're looking forward to hearing from her fair was like, and more particularly, what'd you bring home?
Well, hello everybody. What I brought home, I'm going to go over next week, because this week I want to talk about how Mike Slicker had originally started the Florida Antiquarian Book Fair. When he first started, Sarah, his daughter, was 8 or 9, and she used to come to the book fair and go underneath the skirt of one of his tables and set up like a little house to play with her dolls and to help Michael, and she learned how to do the book fair. Well, as we know, Sarah Slicker Smith is now capably running the book fair. And she and Kevin have their son, Quentin. And Quentin, who is now 8 or 9, is sharp as a tack. I could have eaten him up and taken him home. Absolutely adorable. And he had one bookshelf set up in the front of Mike's stand where he had an open and closed sign, and he said no books priced over $10, cash and change taken. He would open and close his one little book stand. And at one point I said to him, "How many books did you sell, Quentin?" And he said 43. And I said, "How much have you made?" And he said $62. I mean,
Wow.
so yeah, he was thrilled. Anyhow, I had seen a book that he had that was interesting. By no means is it a miniature book, but it was one that I wanted to read myself. So I asked him, "Do you know what it means to barter?" And he said no, and I explained it to him, the system of bartering. And I said, "I want that book, so you save it for me, and later come down to our booth and we will barter." Well, I keep a box of small books like this. Again, not a miniature book. If you walk into a stationery store to buy a card, you are going to see a million of these with that many titles on them on the counter for $3, $4, $5. And if you go out at a yard sale, you can pick them up for a quarter. And when I first started to save miniature books or specialize in them, I was getting these little books. Now I am concentrating on good miniature books. So I have all these little books to get rid of. So when Quentin came down to our booth with his sister, who is younger, and a friend of his who was bigger but younger, I had said to him, "Okay, Quentin, I want this book. And you can take any 2 books out of the box I have like these. And because your sister is with you, she can have 1 book. And because your friend is with you, he can have 1 book." Well, those kids spent a half an hour going through every single one of the books that I had in that box until they picked out what they wanted. I was just so cheerful watching them. His friend kept on saying, "Which is the best book? What's worth the most?" There's a 9-year-old. And I said, "Whatever you want to read, that's the best book." So when they had made their choices and they went away, I had a wonderful experience with a 3rd generation of Slicker to Smith to Quentin Smith. And I was absolutely delighted. Now, what do I do with this box of little books that I have? And they are called little books. I'm sure it says a little book. This one is Hugs for Sisters. And there are Hugs for Fathers, Hugs for Mothers, Hugs for Brothers, Hugs for Friends. Whole series of these books. Not worth much, but I like to have them. And I keep that box there. So when some of these younger people came to our booth, and when I say younger people, I'm talking about couples in their 30s and 40s with a child. Now, parents want to be able to examine the more expensive books. The children weren't really interested, but I told them, while mom and dad are shopping, you can have 1 book out of this box that you can pick out while mom and dad are shopping, and that will be your book. So I was delighted watching children go through the books of a variety of subjects and knowing that they were interested in getting a book of their own. First time I didn't walk the whole fair, which Stephen was getting over his vertigo, And fortunately, there was a constant flow, Thorne, in your booth and in our booth of people that were shopping and looking and buying. It was really a wonderful, wonderful fair. So I didn't get to walk the whole fair, but I did get to buy two things that I will share with you next week in my 5 minutes of fame. But this was a story that I was really so pleased to share because I love the idea of children enjoying coming to the book fair.
So next week or next year, we need to alert people that Alcove 6 is where to send the kids.
Yep, get the free books.
They sure can. They can come to me. I love the children. And there were a lot of children there with their younger parents. I was surprised. A lot of people with a lot of ink, a lot of tattoos, that whole crowd, interested in collectible books, which surprised me. Pleasantly, but it surprised me. And I was delighted to see the variety of people at the fair and the constant flow. I think, again, it was a very good choice. And Stephen and I won one of the $50 off for the lottery next year.
Wow.
When we put in our deposit for our booth for next year. So we will definitely be there in Alcove 6, and we will not have to pay the full price, $50 off on our alcove, because we won the drawing, one of 3 or 4 that they give out every year when you put down your deposit for the following year at the end of the fair.
I will never give up my alcove.
Stephen says he'll never give up his alcove. But again, I really want to thank Kathy Marshall, who got her grandson to come over and help on close-up day. She's in charge. She's one of the security guards, and I love her, and I love her even more for helping us out with that situation. And my friends Ann and John from Odessa, who came over to set up and to close. Marvelous, marvelous. All I do is socialize and look beautiful.
Well,
I'll see you all next week.
Thanks again, Edie. While Steve and Edie trade places, let me remind viewers that you're watching the Rare Book Cafe. We're a weekly show, 2:30 Eastern Time, Facebook and YouTube. You can find us on Facebook at the Rare Book Cafe and Florida Antiquarian, and on YouTube at the Florida Antiquarian Book Fair channel. And we're sponsored every week by the Florida Antiquarian Book Fair. And now it's a pleasure to welcome back Mr. Advil himself, Steve Eisenstein, who is nicely mending from his annual bout of Booksellers back strain. So what's on for today, Steve?
Well, we're talking about dust jackets, and dust jackets have had an interesting history in the wonderful world of rare books. If you go back, let's go backwards from today. There was a point in time that the dust jacket was not emphasized. It wasn't mentioned as much. It wasn't sought after. If you start even further back, let's start it chronologically now. Dust jackets first made their appearances around the 1860s. They were kind of in plain brown wrappers, but there are recorded dust jackets that go back 1 or 2 known copies. I think recently, in the last year, meaning recently, somebody found one from 1816 or 18 that replaced the earliest recorded one of something in the 1820s or 30s. So there was a history of it in the beginning. In the 1860s, it started to show up a little more frequently, but somewhat as a plain brown wrapper. Move forward to about 1898 or the early 1900s, and by then, just about everything had a dust jacket. If you go chronologically further into the 20s and 30s, there was a major contributing factor that caused a lot of dust jackets to be lost, and that was called a decorator. There was a period in time where it was more vogue to show your books on the spines or without the jacket on it. Now, this book is an interesting book. I think at one time I might have had something older, but I wanted to sell it. This, though, is one of the first books that I ever bought. This copy in my hand is one of the first books that I ever bought. Comfort Found in Good Old Books by George Hamlin Fitch. Okay. What I like about it and why I've kept it all along is, first of all, if you look here, my finger is, let me get the one that's got the cleaner nail, that HJ. Harvey and Jimmy is what that stands for. I bought this from my friends Harvey Stanson and Jimmy Dore, who used to own a bookstore called Once Upon a Time Books in Hempstead, New York. They were my mentors, so this book has fond memories for many reasons. Amongst other things, it's published by Paul Elder and Company, which was a nice press in San Francisco. And if I remember the date correctly, it is a first printing of the book, but an 11 dust jacket. And it was very well made, and it has kind of held up through the test of time. So dust jackets came out 1890s, 1900s. By that time, every book had one. Scarcities were created for many reasons besides the decorator. When you take it off the shelf the wrong way, you peel it. It splits, it chips. You just, for some reason, don't read the book with it. You read the book with it and it gets destroyed, it gets lost. And that's what's created the scarcity of the dust jacket. Now, why is the emphasis on the dust jacket? I'm going to use the book I'm not allowed to use because I haven't used it in a long time. Take a book like The Great Gatsby, the finest copy known to man, sold at auction in April of 2014 for $377,000. Without the dust jacket, it's a $5,000 to $10,000 book. The condition of the dust jacket is everything. Over the last 2 or 3 years, I have seen copies of the book at the Florida Antiquarian Book Fair. One was priced at $85,000. The other was sold at $100,000. Was priced at $125,000. Eventually, I found out that those books did eventually sell. But condition is everything. If you have a dust jacket that is chipped, torn, tattered, if you're new, understand that the dust jacket, the condition is everything. It's more than 95% of the value of the book if you actually do the math. And they're extremely rare on some of the books that are most desirable. I wish I could sublimate this dust jacket for another one of the time period of my choice, but that is the market on dust jackets. You want the dust jacket in the book to be in the finest condition. The works of art, to talk about the dust jacket itself as a work of art, well, original art for dust jackets is another area of tremendous collectability. Art, original cover art, whether it be a dust jacket or a magazine, is always going to have value. And it portrays, if you look at the artwork on The Great Gatsby, it's a very mystical picture. You can kind of look at it for a while and see different things. And other dust jackets, well, they might be a little plainer. If you take a book like The Bluest Eye by, help me out here, her name went right out of my head. Toni Morrison, thank you. The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. You look at the jacket, it's an innocuous looking jacket, but it's also a jacket that represents, several $1,000s of the price. A nice copy of that book today, depending on condition, can go for a couple of $1,000s. Take the dust jacket off. While it's not as radical per se as the Gatsby, you're not going to sell the book very easily without it. It's a few $100s for a first if you can find a buyer. And generally speaking, if you find a jacket in very good condition and a collector wants to upgrade, great. If your jacket doesn't match and the condition is a problem, then you don't offer the collector any incentive to upgrade. Dust jackets are important. They became important more so in the last 50 years than they were before that, but it's an important part of the book. And at that note, Thorne, I believe you are going to be talking about book selling and the forgeries that have occurred.
I am, but I wanted to kind of utilize you for an introduction there. There's a website called facsimile-dustjackets.com that makes dust jackets. And they have about 30,000 of them. They're photocopied, they're photographically reproduced. I'm not sure how he does it. They are of books you've never heard of. They're also of books. I have 2 or 3 Faulkners and Fitzgeralds that came without dust jackets. I bought those. I think they're about $10 a piece. They are stamped on them in big letters, facsimile dust jacket, but they are perfect reproductions of the original dust jacket. The beauty of it, the price, the whatever. I use them. It's pretty obvious. I mean, they're 1/4-inch high letters that say facsimile on the inside. But a lot of people use that for protection. So they're by no stretch of imagination meant to be a fake. They're used for protection to make them look nice. The Fitzgeralds in particularly are horrible looking books. They're all black cloth with no visual appeal. So just even having them like that. But anyway, that's just something I thought I'd throw out. I was going to talk about fraud today. We're going to start with, again, back from you, Steve. I had for a while a book, but it was the autobiography of Clarence Darrow, who was a very famous attorney. You guys might remember him as from the Scopes Monkey Trial, great movie with Spencer Tracy. In the reality, Clarence Darrow was a very brilliant lawyer. The trial was about, I think it was Mississippi or Alabama in the 20s, whether or not this guy named Darwin was right. The guy who actually won the trial, proving that Darwin was not right, and let the Darwin's theory fall to the wayside in the state, was a guy named William Jennings Bryan, who ran for president. It was a good movie, good story. But I had a copy of the book, and it was signed by Clarence Darrow. Not a problem. I think I sold it for $500 or $750. But I initially saw a copy on Heritage Auctions that was marked, noted, and sold as a fake signature of that same book. So I went out. I think I might have showed it to you once, bought the Heritage book for, I think I paid 35 or 40 bucks, and sold them both as a set. It was pretty obvious to compare them, but that was an early marketing attempt of mine. It was somewhat foolish. I wouldn't do it again. But there's some other interesting forgeries of signatures, and I'll go into forgeries of books. The Rare Book School where I'm at has a lovely book that is by Mark Twain that they have, and they love to show it once in a while. It was signed by his son or his nephew or something, and everybody knows it. They keep it there for fun. But the one that I personally was involved with, Charles Dickens, we all know, was a wonderful man, wrote lots of things, including the movie we've all seen in the book. I think it was called A Christmas Tale, A Christmas Story or something, with Scrooge and all those good guys. He also wrote a book called, I guess it is, The Christmas Story. And that was only for his children. He was a very successful author at the time. It was written for his children only. And in his will, it was not to be published till upon his death. Upon the death of his last child. So sometime in the 1920s, Mr. Dickens passed away in the late 19th century sometime. His grandson, upon the death of the last child, published the book. It was, I'm not sure who published it. It might have been Putnam's as I remember it. Lovely book. It was about, it was the story of Bethlehem and Jesus. It was a really lovely little book. And I had a copy of it, obviously unsigned for pretty obvious reasons. But I was looking on one of the websites, and I found one that included Mr. Dickens' signature. Now, aside from the fact that, speaking of Darwin and my last little forgery, there's a website I also like called the Darwin Awards for people that commit something so stupid they take them out of the gene pool. I think that one should have taken the bookseller out of the gene pool. It was a it was a card of Mr. Dickens' signature, but he neglected to mention it was a tip-in card. So here he was advertising a signed book of Dickens, published 30 years or 60 years after Mr. Dickens' death, which I thought was kind of funny.
Thorne, I gotta tell you, I once convinced myself that I paid $80 for a book signed by Oscar Wilde.
Yeah.
That was in Italian. The ink signature was perfect. I figured, oh, if nothing else, he probably signed 100 sheets for a book that didn't make it. I rationalized it to myself that it was the real deal. Then I got home and was able to find out that he died 2 years after that book was. I mean, he died 2 years before the book was published, and I had paid $80 for a forgery. But I talked myself into it being real.
Oh, I don't know about that. Maybe it wasn't a forgery. Oscar Wilde was a pretty wild guy. Maybe he just came back and signed a couple of copies. That thing could be priceless.
No, it wasn't.
There was a movie that came out a couple of years ago that I won't mention for obvious reasons, but it was a romance. And in it, the handsome young man gives the beautiful young girl copies of the plays of Aeschylus. And as he hands over he says to her worshipfully, "And it's a first edition." And apparently all the Abe and Biblio and all the aggregate book sites had a sudden surge of requests for first editions of a collection of plays written 2,000 years ago.
If they're in my website, I would have shipped them. No problems.
What if you used to see my etchings? Now you give them the Rembrandt book?
Well, I'm sure a lot of you have heard me talk about John Carter's ABC for Booksellers. A great description of the book, The Answer to the Book Collector's Prayer. Well, John Carter did this. He's passed away. It's now being run by a guy named Nicholas Barker, who's actually one of my heroes too. He runs a magazine called The Book Collector. But the other thing, yeah, there you go, right there. Great magazine.
14 editions around the house, yeah.
What John Carter did that I find absolutely fascinating, I have 2 copies of it. It all kind of looks together. It's an inquiry into the nature of certain 19th century pamphlets by John Carter, our boy here, and Graham Pollard. And this, what I have here, is the 2nd edition, which has an epilogue by the authors and new material by Nicholas Barker, who is, again, the man who's now taking over for Mr. Carter on the Carter's book, and a guy by the name of John Collins. The original book, this is probably a 3rd or 4th or 5th edition here. It is the book forgery of H. Buxom Foreman and T.J. Wise. Again, it's a lovely book. Mr. Wise, so the book world they all do kind of stick together. Mr. Wise was born in 1859, died in 1937. This book came out in 1934. Mr. Wise was one of the most respected book collectors, authorities, bibliophiles. He had a library that people came to visit. This gentleman was absolutely one of the top people. He was probably like Steve. He was just one of the most well-regarded guys in the business.
But I don't do forgeries.
Well, no,
not yet.
What happened in 1934, actually probably late 20s, Mr. Carter's and everybody started looking at and he started selling pamphlets and such by people we might have heard of. Kipling, Tennyson, Browning, goes on and on and on. These were all pamphlets that had never been discovered before. And they were found in various places, various times. And he just happened to have 1 or 2 copies of them. And he was able to sell them. But with his great reputation as a scholar, and he was well regarded at the British Museum and all of this nonsense, he went on and sold. There's 50 to 150 of them floating around. It's actually, hard to believe, but true, a market for the fakes. And I'm talking thousands of dollars, tens of thousands of dollars for a fake Browning if it's connected to Mr. Wise.
Yeah.
The Carters went and found this out, and they were looking at things that I happen to love in my interest in the rare book school. I'm off to do some paperwork this summer. They were looking at the typography on some of these little pamphlets was type that was cast after everybody died. And so it's a little hard to have a first when the guy is signing it when it's dead. The paper, they were able to look at bookmarks, watermarks, things like that. Find the paper was produced in 1920. Again, hard to make a 1870 first edition on 1920 paper. And so Mr. Carter and I'm sorry, the other gentleman's name always escapes me, Mr. Graham Pollard, were both distinguished people, and they brought this to everybody's attention. It made all the newspapers in England. I mean, the headlines, famous books were all a fraud. And then it comes out that I think I mentioned that Mr. Wise had a very large collection of his own books. He kept saying he was not a dealer and he was just a scholar, and he would, people would ask him questions like they asked Steve, and he would have these marvelous books. And there's a term called sophistication, which is totally fine. I understand that most of the Shakespeare's first editions, the Gutenberg Bibles nowadays, aren't really 100% all the leaves from the first one. A lot of the books, when put back together, the first 108 pages of a Gutenberg Bible burned, the last 100 pages of another Gutenberg Bible burned. They put the two together. This has been known for 200 years that this is two books put together. You've heard us all talk about leaves like the one I bought. Some of these leaves come from books that people have got it. But the one thing I want to tell that ended up very fine, apparently Mr. Wise, as part of his collection, had borrowed leaves, something called the British Museum, to make his books a lot better. And the British Museum does not take lightly to people cutting pieces of their very valuable books and putting them in your own books. So they got Mr. Wise, who never meant anything and passed away, but he was one of the great forgers of all time. He just unfortunately died a couple of years too late because he got caught. Steve, what do you have to tell us about?
Well, we're kind of close to that time of the day where, unfortunately, we are kind of out of time. Never out of material on the Rare Book Cafe, but we are out of time. I want to thank everybody involved in putting together the book fair. Thank you from the patrons to Sarah and Kevin and everybody, Alan Smith, Thorne, Lindsay. Lindsay, we can't do this without you. You are invaluable, and we all thank you. So during the week, be sure to join us on the Rare Book Cafe's Facebook page, where we invite you to post, comment, and question away. Tell us about your books, your friends, your relationships with those books, and we would be happy to hear from you. Our shows are archived on the Rare Book Cafe's Facebook page, the Florida Antiquarian Book Fair blog. That's floridabookfair.blogspot. The Book Fair's YouTube channel. You can email us questions, comments. If you have an old book in your house and you want to find out what it's worth, rarebookcafe@gmail.com, or any other kind of questions. Thanks for all of you who attended the book fair. Lindsay, Kara, everybody at Biblio and Abe, we want to thank you. Alan Smith, hope we see you next week. 30 hours of the book fair. That was quite a job. And thanks to our main sponsors, Biblio.com and Abe Books, fair manager Sarah Smith and her team, the St. Petersburg Coliseum, Sunlit Festival, and all the others who made the 2017 book fair so successful. I just learned this now. The ATM ran out of money. The Rare Book Cafe is brought to you by the Florida Antiquarian Book Fair. We're going to be 37 years old. Be sure to join us in 2018. The book fair features more than 100 book dealers from around the country and around the world. For book lovers, it's paradise. Ciao for now. We'll see you on the cafe next week, and tune in to Bucks on the Bookshelf at 12 to 2 next Saturday, WDBFradio.com. Have a great weekend.